I've spent 3 decades in a machine shop, measuring the world in thousandths of an inch. I know what's solid, and I know exactly what it takes to break a man. For 30 years, I believed that if a problem was big enough, you could fix it with steel or grit. I was wrong. 3 years ago, in the deep hollows of the Kentucky backcountry, something came for us that didn't follow the laws of physics or nature. It was 7 feet of gaunt, hateful muscle that took a high-powered round to the chest and didn't even flinch. I am the only one who made it out of that hunting blind, and I am the only one left to tell you that the woods aren't empty. My name is George Rico. I'm 54 years old and my hands are still calloused from a lifetime of cutting parts for industrial equipment. I'm a practical man. I don't believe in ghost stories or things that go bump in the night. I believe in measurements and tolerances. But what happened during that deer season in the Bluegrass State defies everything I know to be true. Every year, my friend Willie Oberg and I would drive into the thickest part of the forest, far away from the paved roads and the noise of the city. Willie was a wiry woodsman, the kind of man who could read a trail like a map, and we had a ritual that had survived decades. It was about the smell of wet earth, the weight of the rifle, and the absolute silence of a Kentucky morning. That year, we pushed deeper than we ever had before, setting up our blind near a forgotten game trail where the trees grew so tight they seemed to choke out the sun. The first night was peaceful. The last night is why I now live in a city made of concrete, sleeping with the lights on and a 9 under my pillow. The tires of my old Silverado groaned as they bit into the soft, red clay of the Daniel Boone National Forest, a sound as familiar to me as the steady hum of a lathe back at the shop. Beside me, Willie Oberg sat with his boots up on the dash, his wiry frame vibrating with every rut we hit. He was humming some old bluegrass tune under his breath, a habit that used to grate on my nerves 20 years ago, but now felt like the only thing keeping the world from spinning off its axis. We had been doing this for 3 decades. Every November, the world outside Lancaster County ceased to exist, replaced by the scent of wood smoke, gun oil, and the crushing weight of a tradition that had become our religion. Willie wasn't just my hunting partner. He was the person who knew the exact depth of the silence I kept. When my wife left 10 years ago, Willie didn't offer platitudes or self-help books. He just showed up at my door with a case of beer and a topographical map, pointing to a ridge in Kentucky where the world didn't ask you to explain yourself. He knew how to play on my guilt, too, a subtle emotional blackmail he'd perfected over the years. Whenever I'd mention the shop being busy or the metal plates in my arm acting up, he'd look at me with those steady, hawk-like eyes and say, "George, we're the last of the line. If we don't go, the trail goes cold for good. You really want to be the one who lets the fire die out." He knew I couldn't say no to that. He knew my greatest fear was being the man who broke a 30-year chain. As we climbed higher into the backcountry, the trees began to crowd the truck, their skeletal branches scraping against the paint like fingernails on a chalkboard. The air was turning sharp, that peculiar Kentucky dampness that settles into your marrow and stays there. I looked over at Willie's hands, wiry, stained with tobacco and grease, clutched around a thermos of black coffee. He was the better woodsman, always had been. He could spot a rub on a cedar limb from 50 yards in the brush while I was still trying to find my footing on the frozen leaves. I relied on his eyes, and he relied on my strength. It was a trade we'd made a long time ago. "You feeling it this year, George?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. He didn't look at me, but I felt the weight of the question. It wasn't about the deer. It was about the unspoken agreement that we were getting older, that the mountains were getting steeper, and that every year we returned was a small, desperate theft from time itself. "I'm feeling the cold," I replied, gripping the steering wheel tight enough to make my knuckles turn white. "My arm is aching already." Willie let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a porch. "That's just the mountain testing you. It wants to know if you're still solid. You start listening to that ache, and pretty soon you're sitting in a recliner waiting for the end." Is that what you want? To be a man who's afraid of a little Pennsylvania winter in his bones?" He knew exactly where to twist the knife. He made my physical pain feel like a moral failing, a weakness of character I had to overcome to prove I was still the man he'd spent half his life with. It was an emotional trap, but I stepped into it willingly every single time because the alternative, being alone with the silence of my own house, was far worse. We reached the trailhead just as the sun began to bleed out over the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and sickly oranges. The woods here didn't feel like the friendly, managed forests back home. They felt old. They felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. We began the long haul to our spot, our packs heavy with gear that felt twice as weighted as it had the year before. Willie led the way, his pace relentless, never looking back to see if I was keeping up. He knew I'd follow. He knew I didn't have a choice. The trail narrowed until it was barely a scar on the earth, hemmed in by thickets of mountain laurel and ancient oaks that seemed to watch our progress with a cold, wooden indifference. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. No birds, no squirrels, just the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the frost and the sound of our own heavy breathing. It was a silence that felt heavy, almost liquid, as if it were filling up our ears and lungs. "We're pushing further this time," Willie whispered, though there was no one around to hear him. "I found a spot on the Scout, high ridge, overlooking a blind in a natural bottleneck. Big buck territory, George, the kind of trophies people don't believe in anymore." I looked at the way the shadows were lengthening, stretching out like long, dark fingers across the path. "Willie, it's getting late. Maybe we should set camp here." He stopped and turned, the twilight catching the gray in his beard, making him look like a ghost already. "You getting soft on me? We've got another mile to the blind. If we stop now, we miss the morning transition. Don't tell me 30 years of tradition ends because you're tired. I'm counting on you, George. I can't do this alone." There it was again, the anchor of his expectations. He made his needs my responsibility, casting his own survival as something that only I could guarantee. It was a burden I wore like my hunting vest, heavy and stiff, but I adjusted my pack and nodded. We kept walking, moving deeper into the shadows of the Kentucky backcountry, unaware that the tradition we were so desperate to keep alive was about to become our greatest nightmare. The mile to the high ridge felt like 5, my boots dragging through the thickening leaf litter as the Kentucky canopy closed in like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral. Willie moved ahead of us with that irritating, rhythmic grace, his frame cutting through the gloom while I wrestled with the dead weight of the tent and the steel fire ring. We finally reached the clearing, a flat, narrow shelf of earth shielded by a wall of ancient, gnarled hemlocks. It was a good spot, objectively speaking, defensible and dry, but as I dropped the pack, the silence of the place didn't feel like peace. It felt like an audience waiting for a performance. We worked with the practiced efficiency of 2 men who had shared the same small patch of dirt for 30 years. I staked the corners of the tent, my hands fumbling slightly as the temperature began its rapid, evening plummet. Willie gathered wood, his headlamp a restless firefly darting through the underbrush. Usually, this was the part I loved, the physical labor of making a home out of nothing. But tonight, every snap of a dry twig under Willie's feet made the hair on my arms stand up. I found myself checking the tree line every time his light moved too far away. "You're twitchy, George," Willie said, dropping a load of seasoned oak near the fire ring. He didn't look up, his hands already busy arranging the tinder. It wasn't a question. It was an observation designed to make me feel small. "You've been checking your 6 since we crossed the creek. You think a black bear is going to come for a man with 30 years of grease in his pores?" I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, the white plume of it visible in my headlamp beam. "The woods feel heavy, Willie. You can't tell me you don't feel it." He paused, a single match flaring between his fingers, casting long, distorted shadows across his weathered face. "I feel the cold. I feel the hunger. Anything else is just you looking for an excuse to be back in your living room." He struck the match, the flame licking hungrily at the cedar shavings. If you're going to let your nerves ruin this, just say so. I can pack it up. We can head back and tell everyone we got spooked by the wind. Is that the story you want to tell?" It was the same emotional lever he always pulled, framing my intuition as cowardice, making my survival instinct look like a betrayal of our shared history. He knew I'd rather face a pack of wolves than his disappointment. So I sat down in the camp chair, the nylon creaking under my weight, and watched the fire begin to roar. For a moment, the heat was a sanctuary. The orange glow pushed back the black wall of the forest, creating a small, flickering world where things made sense. We heated some stew on the propane stove, the steam smelling of salt and beef, and for 20 minutes, the Bluegrass Tradition felt real again. We talked about the shift at the shop and the way the metal plates in my arm always knew when a cold front was coming before the meteorologists did. But as the fire settled into a bed of glowing embers, the wood seemed to creep closer. The initial comfort of the flames began to fade, replaced by the realization of how small our circle of light actually was. The hemlocks behind us weren't just trees anymore. They were a solid, impenetrable barrier. "The wind died down," I whispered, realizing that even the rustle of the leaves had stopped. Willie was cleaning his knife, the whetstone making a slow shuck-shuck sound. He didn't answer right away. He just looked into the blackness beyond the hemlocks, his eyes narrow and focused. "The woods always go quiet before a freeze, George. Don't make it more than it is." But I noticed he didn't put the knife away. He kept it in his hand, his thumb tracing the edge of the blade over and over. The damp cold of the Kentucky backcountry began to win the battle against the fire. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was a physical presence that seemed to leak out of the shadows, smelling of wet fur and ancient, rotting mulch. I reached for another log, but Willie put a hand on my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong, his fingers like iron bands. "Save it for the morning," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. "We need to turn in. The deer will be moving at first light, and I don't want you dragging your feet because you stayed up watching the sparks." He was using that tone again, the one that suggested my exhaustion was a burden he was tired of carrying. He made me feel like an anchor, even as he was the one dragging us deeper into the dark. I stood up, my knees popping, and followed him toward the tent. As I reached for the zipper, I looked back at the fire. The embers were a deep, angry red, like a dozen tiny eyes watching us retreat. Inside the tent, the nylon walls felt paper-thin. I slid into my bag, the cold fabric biting at my skin. Beside me, Willie was a dark shape, perfectly still, his breathing shallow and controlled. He was waiting. I lay there for an hour, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the absolute, unnatural silence of the ridge. Then, just as I felt sleep finally pulling at me, I heard it. It wasn't a snap or a rustle. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud, the sound of something massive shifting its weight on the damp earth just inches from the back of the tent. It was followed by a long, wet exhale that smelled like iron and old blood. "Willie," I breathed, my voice barely a vibration. "Go to sleep, George," he snapped, his voice sharp with a fake bravado that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's just the ground settling." But he didn't roll over. He stayed perfectly still, his hand gripped tight around the handle of the knife he'd never put away, both of us trapped in a silence that was rapidly running out of time. The thin nylon wall of the tent was no longer a shelter. It had become a translucent veil between us and whatever was out there in the Kentucky blackness. I lay paralyzed, my ears ringing from the effort of trying to hear through the thudding of my own pulse. The damp cold had turned into a needle-sharp chill that seemed to radiate from the ground, through my sleeping pad, and directly into my spine. Beside me, Willie was a statue, his breathing so shallow I thought he might have stopped altogether. He had spent the last 20 years convincing me that I was the fragile one, the man who needed the woods to toughen up. But in the absolute stillness of that ridge, the roles felt like they were dissolving. The sound returned, and this time there was no mistaking it for the ground settling. It was a methodical, heavy scraping, the sound of something with immense weight dragging a limb or a tool across the frozen earth. It moved from the back of the tent toward the entrance, a slow, deliberate circuit that felt less like an animal foraging and more like a predator measuring its cage. Then, the scraping stopped exactly where the mesh door met the dirt. I watched the fabric. In the faint, dying glow of the embers outside, a shadow began to rise against the tent wall. It wasn't the jagged outline of a bear or the lean curve of a buck. It was a towering, angular silhouette that kept going up until it eclipsed the top of the door frame. I could see the distinct, jagged edges of what looked like coarse, matted fur. Then came the smell, a thick, suffocating wave of wet dog, metallic rot, and something ancient that made my stomach turn. "Willie," I mouthed again, the word catching in my dry throat like a piece of flint. "Shut up, George," he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying, brittle edge. He shifted, the fabric of his sleeping bag loud as a gunshot in the quiet. "You're going to spiral. You're going to get us both worked up over a stray coyote or a coon. Just close your eyes. If you can't handle a night in the bush without losing your mind, maybe you really have gotten as soft as everyone says." The emotional blackmail hit me like a physical blow, even now. He was using my reputation, my own sense of masculinity, to silence me while he stared at the same shadow I did. He was terrified, but his pride demanded that I be the one who was losing it. It was a cruel, desperate tactic to keep himself from screaming, and it worked. I swallowed my terror, my hands shaking as I gripped the edges of my bag, forcing myself to be the solid man he required me to be. Suddenly, a long, dark shape pressed against the mesh. It wasn't a paw. It was a hand, or something close to it, with thick, elongated fingers that ended in heavy, curved claws. The mesh groaned under the pressure as the thing leaned in, its silhouette blocking out what little light remained. I could hear a low, vibrating hum coming from the other side of the fabric, a sound so deep it felt like it was rattling the metal plates in my arm. It was a sound of intelligent curiosity, a predator assessing the thickness of the skin that stood between it and its meal. Then came the exhale. A long, wet huff of air hit the tent, the heat of it momentarily warming the nylon before the frost reclaimed it. The scent of old blood was so strong now I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. "It's right there," I whispered, the rules of Willie's game breaking under the weight of the reality in front of us. "Willie, look at the claws. That's not a bear." Willie finally moved. He sat up, his shadow merging with the creature for a fleeting, horrifying second. I saw him reach for his rifle, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The wiry woodsman was gone, replaced by a man whose bravado had finally hit a wall it couldn't climb over. "I see it, George," he whispered, his voice finally cracking, stripped of its authority. "God help me, I see it." The creature outside let out a soft, guttural click, a sound that seemed to mock our hushed voices. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the pressure on the mesh vanished. The shadow receded into the hemlocks, not with a crash but with a terrifying, fluid silence. We sat there in the dark for hours, rifles across our laps, the silence of the Kentucky backcountry now feeling like a countdown. Willie didn't apologize for what he'd said, and I didn't ask him to. We were no longer hunting partners. We were two men who realized that the tradition had led us into a place where we were the ones being harvested. The gray light of dawn didn't bring the usual relief. It only revealed how vulnerable we were inside a house made of fabric. We didn't speak as we broke camp. The ritual was gone, replaced by a frantic, mechanical haste. Willie wouldn't look at me. He was busy cinching straps with a violence that spoke of a man trying to outrun his own memory. The emotional atmosphere had curdled. The previous night's blackmail had shifted from "you're being soft" to a cold, suffocating silence that blamed me for witnessing his fear. He needed to get to the blind. He needed the walls of that small plywood box to convince himself he was still the hunter, and he was going to drag me there whether I wanted to go or not. As we stepped onto the narrow ridge trail, the Kentucky woods were eerily still. The frost-covered leaves crunched like broken glass under our boots, a sound that felt dangerously loud in the vacuum of the forest. We had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when I felt the shift in the air. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a pressure, a displacement of space to my right. I slowed my pace, my heart hammering against the metal plates in my arm, and that's when I heard it. A heavy, singular thud in the deep brush, perfectly timed with my own footfall. I stopped, the sound stopped. "Willie," I whispered, my hand tightening on the grip of my rifle until my calloused fingers went numb. "It's back, to the right about 40 yards in." Willie didn't stop. He didn't even turn around. He just kept walking, his pack swaying with a rhythmic, mocking indifference. "Keep moving, George. It's a deer following the ridge line. Your let's play pretend again. You start stopping every time a squirrel jumps and we're sitting ducks in the open. You want to be the reason we're caught out here without cover." His words were a barbed wire fence, hemmed in by the implication that my caution was the real danger. He was using my survival instinct against me, suggesting that by wanting to assess the threat, I was actually manifesting one. It was a masterful bit of psychological leverage. If I stayed quiet, I was a good partner. If I spoke up, I was a liability. I took 3 more steps. It wasn't a deer. A deer is light, skittering, and cautious. This was heavy, purposeful, and bipedal. The strides were long, much longer than a man's, and the weight behind them made the very ground vibrate beneath my boots. Whatever was moving parallel to us wasn't trying to hide. It was hurting us. It was keeping pace, moving through the thick mountain laurel with a fluid, terrifying grace that didn't snap a single branch. It was showing us that it could move through the impenetrable tangle of the Kentucky backcountry, as easily as we moved on a cleared path. I risked a glance to the side. The woods were a chaotic mess of gray trunks and dark green laurel, but for a split second I saw a flash of movement, a patch of coarse, dark fur that seemed to absorb the dim morning light. Then, a glimpse of a limb, long and gaunt, ending in those same heavy, yellowed claws I'd seen pressed against the tent mesh. It moved with a digitigrade hitch, its knees or ankles bending backward like a wolf's, but it was standing upright, easily 7 feet tall even while ducking under the low-hanging oak limbs. "Willie, I see it, it's right there," I half-shouted, my voice cracking with a primal, gut-wrenching terror. Willie finally spun around, his face a mask of calculated fury. He stepped close, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee, his eyes boring into mine with a look of pure, desperate manipulation. "You listen to me, George Rico. You are older, you are tired, and your head is full of machinist's tolerances that don't apply out here. There is nothing there. If you break ranks now, if you start shooting at shadows, you're the one who's going to get us killed. You owe me 30 years of friendship to pull it together. Are you a man, or are you a ghost?" He was blackmailing my soul, demanding that I ignore my own lying eyes to preserve his shattered sense of control. He was forcing me to choose between my reality and his pride. And because I didn't want to be the man who failed his best friend, I let him turn me around. I let him push me forward toward the blind, even as I heard the heavy footsteps pick up again, closer this time, just behind the curtain of the mountain laurel. The walk became a nightmare of synchronized movement. Every step I took was echoed by a heavy, wet thud in the brush. The smell of metallic rot and wet dog grew so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. I knew we weren't walking to a hunting spot. We were walking into a corner. Willie was leading us to the blind, convinced that 4 walls and a roof would save him, while I could feel the intelligent, predatory gaze of the thing in the brush burning into the side of my neck. We were being escorted to the slaughter, and the only man I trusted in the world was the one holding my hand as we walked toward the gate. The plywood walls of the hunting blind felt less like a fortress and more like a coffin as we finally scrambled inside, the hinges of the door groaning in a high-pitched protest that seemed to echo for miles. It was a cramped, 4x4 box, smelling of stale cedar, and the copper tang of the rifle oil I'd applied with trembling fingers that morning. Willie moved to the front opening, his wiry frame blocking the narrow slit of gray light. He wasn't looking for deer. He was staring at the wall of mountain laurel we had just escaped, his shoulders pulled tight up to his ears. The air inside the blind was already growing stagnant, the warmth of our frantic breathing creating a thin mist on the plexiglass windows. "We're in, George," Willie whispered, his voice brittle like dry parchment. "You see, the blind changes the game. We have the high ground, the cover. We're the ones behind the glass now." He was trying to sell the lie to me, but mostly he was selling it to himself. He sat on the small wooden bench, his rifle resting across his knees, and looked at me with a desperate, wide-eyed intensity. "Don't start with that look again, that I told you so face. I brought us here to keep us safe. If we'd stayed on that trail, exposed, you'd have cracked. I saved us from your own head, George. You owe it to me to sit still and be the partner I've carried for 30 years. The emotional weight of his words was suffocating. Even as the heavy, rhythmics of the creature had followed us to the very edge of the clearing, Willie was still using our history as a weapon. He was blackmailing me with my own gratitude, demanding that I ignore the literal monster outside because he had provided a plywood box for us to die in. I sat on the opposite bench, the metal plates in my arm throbbing in the damp cold, and watched the tree line. I wanted to scream that his pride was going to get us killed, but the silence between us was a thick, physical barrier. The woods outside had gone into a state of total, unnatural arrest. The squirrels that usually chattered in the oaks were gone. The wind had died, leaving the Kentucky backcountry in a vacuum of stillness. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the frantic ticking of my own watch. Then, the silence was shattered. Crack! It was a single, violent snap that sounded like a lightning strike. It came from the dense thicket of rhododendrons 30 yards to our left. This wasn't the sound of a deer stepping on a twig or a bear leaning against a rotten trunk. It was the sound of a green, living branch, one the size of my thigh, being snapped clean in half. The violence of it vibrated through the floor of the blind, rattling the spare ammunition boxes in my pack. I gripped the stock of my rifle, my knuckles white against the wood. "Willie," I breathed, the word barely a wisp of air. "I heard it," he snapped, his voice jumping an octave. He didn't move toward the window, he shrank back against the rear wall, his shadow merging with the dark corners of the blind. "It's just a deadfall. Old oak limb finally giving up. Happens all the time in the freeze. Don't you dare start. Don't you dare tell me I was wrong to come here." He was terrified, but his ego was still the primary occupant of the room. He was more afraid of being wrong than he was of whatever had just broken that branch. He looked at me, his eyes pleading and accusatory all at once. "If you panic now, George, you're throwing away everything we've built. You're telling me 30 years of friendship doesn't buy me the benefit of the doubt. You want to be the coward who broke the chain over a falling branch." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I leaned forward, peering through the narrow slit of the front window. The laurel was moving, not a gentle sway, but a heavy, deliberate parting of the brush. A massive, gaunt shape was beginning to emerge, its coarse, dark fur matted with frozen mud. I could see the immense breadth of its shoulders, wider than any man I'd ever worked with at the shop. It didn't walk like an animal. It moved with a fluid, predatory intelligence, its head swiveling as it scented the air. Suddenly, the creature stopped. It turned its head toward the blind, its muzzle elongated and misshapen, and I saw them, two pale, luminous yellow eyes that seemed to cut through the gloom like searchlights. It knew we were inside. It had herded us into this box, and now it was standing there, waiting for us to realize that the walls weren't a shield. They were a gift wrapper. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl that I felt in my teeth. It was a sound of pure, intelligent menace. Willie was frozen against the back wall, his rifle forgotten in his lap, his face a mask of shattered bravado. The Bluegrass Tradition had ended the moment that branch snapped, replaced by a hyperspecific reality of wood, cold, and a predator that was done playing with its food. Before the silence breaks, if you're gripped by George's story, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to Howl After Dark. It's the best way to support the channel and ensure you never miss an encounter. I also want to know, which location are you watching from tonight? Let me know your city or state in the comments. I love seeing where our listeners are tuning in from. The pale, luminous yellow eyes didn't just reflect the dim Kentucky light. They seemed to generate it, burning through the thicket with a cold, hateful cunning that made the plywood walls of the blind feel as transparent as glass. I had spent my life looking at the flat, unreadable eyes of deer and bears, but these were different. They were intelligent, filled with a focused attention that told me the creature wasn't just hungry, it was calculating. It stood at the edge of the clearing, a towering, 7-foot silhouette of impossible angles, its gaunt frame and immensely broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the morning frost. It didn't charge, and it didn't growl. It simply watched us, its oversized, wolf-like head tilted slightly as if it were listening to the frantic, uneven rhythm of our heartbeats. Beside me, Willie was unraveling. The man who had spent 30 years leveraging our friendship to keep me in these woods was now shrinking into the corner, his rifle clattering against the wooden bench. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of resentment in his eyes, a desperate psychological pivot to protect his own ego. "Don't you look at it, George," he hissed, his voice a jagged, pathetic whisper. "If you stare back, you're inviting it in. You've always been the one to let things get under your skin, and now you're doing it again. If we die in this box, it's because you couldn't keep your head. You owe it to me to look away. After everything I've done to keep this tradition alive for you, the least you can do is hold your nerve." Even with a nightmare staring us down, Willie was still trying to be the gatekeeper of my reality, using my own sense of obligation as a gag. He wanted me to be the failure so he didn't have to be the victim. But I couldn't look away. Those yellow eyes held me in a state of high alert, a primal, gut-wrenching terror that eclipsed every rationalization Willie had ever fed me. The creature's lips were black and thin, pulled back in a silent snarl to reveal a mouthful of long, yellow canines that looked like a collection of daggers. A single line of drool trickled from the corner of its misshapen muzzle, steaming in the frigid air. The creature took a step forward, its movement fluid and sickeningly fast, shifting from a bipedal stance to a low, quadrupedal crouch that made it look like a massive, matted spider. The smell hit us then, a rank, musky odor of rotting meat and wet fur mixed with a sharp, metallic tang that I realized with a jolt was the scent of blood. It wasn't just watching a blind, it was assessing a cage. Every time it blinked, the yellow glow seemed to intensify, pulsing with a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my boots. "George, please," Willie whimpered, his emotional blackmail finally dissolving into raw, naked pleading. "You're the strong one. You're the one with the steady hands. If you don't do something, I'm never going to see my boy graduate. You want that on your conscience. You want to be the reason I don't go home." He was pinning the weight of his entire life on my shoulders, making his survival my moral debt. He was forcing me to be the hero of a story he had spent 30 years telling me I wasn't good enough to lead. I gripped the cold metal of my rifle, my hands shaking so violently I feared the safety would click and draw the creature's full fury. We were trapped in an eternity of a single second, locked in a stare with a thing that had murdered the sun, waiting for the moment the intelligent malice outside finally decided to break the wood. The plywood walls offered no sanctuary as the yellow eyes vanished from the tree line, replaced by a sudden, predatory silence that was far more terrifying than the stare. I could hear the wet, heavy thud of footsteps circling the blind, a methodical assessment of the weak points in our wooden box. Willie was huddled on the floor, his rifle abandoned as he gripped my jacket with trembling hands, his voice a frantic, low-velocity stream of guilt. "You have to fix this, George," he hissed, his eyes wide and vacant. "I only came here because you needed this. I risked everything to keep our tradition alive for you, and now look where we are. If you don't take the shot, if you let that thing in here, you're the one who's murdering my family. You owe it to me to be the man I've always told everyone you were." The emotional blackmail was the only thing louder than the scratching on the exterior walls. He was making his life my debt, forcing me to bear the weight of his survival while he crumbled under the pressure of the nightmare we had sought out. Then, the scratching stopped. For 3 heartbeats, the Kentucky woods were as silent as a tomb. The breach didn't come from the door, it came from the roof. The plywood overhead shattered with a sound like a bone snapping, and a massive, dark-furred limb exploded through the ceiling. Those heavy, yellowed claws, thick as industrial daggers, swiped through the air, narrowly missing my head as the creature let out a high, piercing shriek of rage. The blind rocked on its stilts, the structural integrity failing as 700 pounds of gaunt muscle and hate began to pull the roof apart. Willie screamed, a thin, pathetic sound that seemed to act as a dinner bell for the thing above us. "George, do something," he wailed, pinning me against the wall as he tried to use my larger frame as a shield. He was still blackmailing me even in the face of death, demanding my protection while he offered nothing but frantic, paralyzing terror. I looked up through the jagged hole in the roof and saw the misshapen muzzle, the black lips pulled back to reveal rows of long, pointed teeth dripping with thick, hot saliva. The smell of metallic rot and wet fur was overwhelming, the scent of a predator that had already tasted blood. I didn't think about the tradition, and I didn't think about Willie's guilt. I raised my rifle, the barrel shaking as I aimed into the dark mass above us, and pulled the trigger. The roar of the shot was deafening in the tiny space, and as the muzzle flash illuminated the creature's surprised fury, the safety of the blind vanished forever. The roar of the .3006 in that confined, splintering box was more than a sound. It was a physical shockwave that slammed into my chest and rattled the very fillings in my teeth. For a split second, the muzzle flash burned the image of the creature into my retinas, a hellish tableau of matted dark fur, a chest as broad as a barrel, and eyes that didn't just reflect light, but seemed to consume it. The beast grunted, a deep, guttural sound of surprised fury as the lead hammered into its torso, but it didn't fall. Instead, it shrieked, a high, piercing sound that scraped my nerves raw and made me want to claw my own ears off. Willie was a dead weight against my side, his fingers dug into my arm with a strength born of pure, unadulterated panic. "You didn't kill it, George. You only made it mad," he wailed, his voice cracking into a ragged sob. "If we die here, it's on you. I gave you the shot, I gave you the chance, and you missed the mark. Don't you dare let it touch me. You owe me that much for every mile I've led you through these woods." Even as the roof was being peeled away like a tin can, his emotional blackmail was a reflex, a desperate attempt to shove the responsibility of our survival onto my shaking shoulders, so he wouldn't have to face the consequence of his own pride. The blind lurched violently as the creature dropped from the roof to the ground, slamming its weight against the plywood door. The wood groaned and shattered, and then the thing was inside the narrow space with us. It hit me like a freight train, its massive weight crushing the breath from my lungs and slamming my head back against the remaining wall. My rifle, that heavy iron comfort, was wrenched from my hands and disappeared into the chaos of the shadows. I was on my back, gasping for air that tasted of wet dog and metallic rot. The creature was on top of me, its hot, foul breath huffing against my face as its yellow eyes burned inches from mine. I saw its mouth open, a cavern of long, yellow daggers dripping with thick saliva. I threw my left arm up in a useless, reflexive gesture of protection, and then the world exploded into white-hot agony. I heard the bone in my forearm snap before I felt the full heat of it. The creature's jaws clamped down and it began to worry my arm, shaking its head back and forth like a dog with a chew toy. I screamed, a thin, pathetic sound that was swallowed by the beast's low, vibrating growl. Through the haze of pain, I saw Willie cowering in the corner, his eyes vacant, making no move to help. He had spent 30 years telling me he was the one who looked out for me, but when the iron met the bone, he was just another shadow in the dark. Adrenaline, sharp and cold, surged through me, a last-ditch survival instinct that eclipsed the fire in my arm. With my good hand, I fumbled for the hunting knife sheathed on my belt, my fingers feeling like clumsy sausages as I fought the snap. The creature was still savaging my arm, focused on the kill. I got the knife free. I didn't aim. I just plunged the 6-inch blade with every ounce of my remaining strength into the side of its thick, musky neck, right below the jaw. It shrieked again, that same horrifying, unnatural sound, and let go of my arm. It recoiled, shaking its head as a dark stream of blood began to pump from the wound, coating the floor of the ruined blind. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was enough to break its momentum. The beast stood on its hind legs, towering 7 feet over me in the wreckage, one hand-like paw pressed to the hole in its neck as it stared at me with a murderous, intelligent light. In that moment, the iron had failed, the wood had failed, and the only thing left was the raw, bleeding reality of the hunt. I didn't look back at the ruins of the blind, and I didn't look back for Willie. The drive out of those Kentucky hollows is a fragmented blur of white-hot agony, and the rhythmic bang of a flat tire I didn't dare stop to change. Now, my world has shrunk to a third-floor apartment in a city where the horizon is made of steel, and the air smells of exhaust rather than damp hemlock. There are no trees here, no natural bottlenecks, and no deep woods where a branch can snap with the weight of a nightmare. I live in the concrete silence now, a place where the only tradition left is staying alive until the sun comes up. My left arm is a roadmap of what happens when you let someone else's pride lead you into the dark. It's full of metal plates and surgical screws that hum with a dull, throbbing fire whenever the humidity spikes. Every time I look at the jagged, silver scars, I hear Willie's voice, not as it was during our 30 years of hunting, but the way it sounded at the end, high, brittle, and desperate to make his survival my moral debt. He spent a lifetime blackmailing me into the woods, telling me I owed it to our friendship to be solid, only to leave me holding the iron while he became a shadow in the corner of a collapsing box. I don't like the quiet anymore. In the backcountry, quiet was a gift. Here, it's a threat. I sleep with the television on, the flickering blue light and the meaningless chatter of late-night infomercials serving as a barrier against the memory of those pale, luminous yellow eyes. I never go out after the streetlights hum to life. People in the city think I'm just another cautious old man, but they don't understand the hyperspecific geometry of my fear. They don't know that I've memorized the exact distance between my front door and the elevator, or why I carry a 9 pistol even to the communal laundry room. It feels small and useless against a 7-foot-tall gaunt frame that can take a .3006 to the chest and keep coming, but it's the only steel I have left to trust. The official reports call it an animal attack by an unidentified predator of unusual size. They found the blood that wasn't mine or Willie, and they found the tracks that shouldn't exist, and then they closed the case because the truth doesn't fit into a police ledger. I sold the machine shop and the house in Lancaster County because the rustle of the wind in the oaks started sounding too much like a heavy, rhythmic footfall. I traded the mountains for a flat place surrounded by people I don't know, yet I've never been more alone. Sometimes, when the city noise dies down and the hum of the refrigerator is the only thing in the room, I feel the old emotional pull, the guilt of being the one who made it out. I wonder if Willie is still out there in the Sproul State Forest, or if he's just another part of the rot beneath the mountain laurel. But then I remember the intelligent malice in that stare, and I realize the woods were never ours to begin with. I am a machinist who can no longer measure the world, because I know there are things in the dark that don't follow the laws of steel. I stay in the light now, trapped in a different kind of blind, waiting for a morning that never quite feels safe enough to believe in. If this story chilled you to the bone, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Howl After Dark for more encounters from the deep woods. I want to hear from you. Which location are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below.